Mark Odland from White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Is that right?
Well, that's where I used to live. It's where my group practice still is.
Okay, good. And so you're the director of Northwoods Christian Counseling.
I am. Yep.
And is that the group practice?
That's the group. That's the group practice. And then we moved up a couple hours north to Duluth, Minnesota, a few years ago.
Okay, good.
And I had a solo practice up there called Lion Counseling.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Mark Odland, Mark is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a highly qualified EMDR clinician, trainer, consultant with years of experience, and just grateful to have you here today, Mark. Thanks for being with me.
Yeah, my pleasure, Bo. Good to be here.
Yeah. So, Mark has a lot of experience, has been involved in many things, and we could talk. We could go in many different directions today on different things. But what I want to talk specifically today about is spiritual trauma, and just the reality of spiritual trauma, what that looks like, and as with everything, that there is hope for healing for people who have been harmed spiritually. So, Mark, I'm just going to offer up that introduction and invite you just to tell us a bit about you and your experience. And
yeah, definitely. Well, so for my clinic, we do a lot of faith-based counseling. So a lot of people seek us out for that reason. Mm-hmm. But as the years went by, we started to notice something really interesting, is that there is a large percentage of people that were really they were coming to us not because they felt like they had a strong faith, but because their faith had been wounded in some way. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes within the church, their experience growing up, or and there's this kind of tension inside because they're trying to navigate. Is this even trauma? If so, how do I heal from that? Can I still hold on to my faith without abandoning my family or my denomination or my church? There are all these questions that really struck deep for people. And I started to see some themes emerge. And so that led me to spend about 9 months creating a course, which was approved by the EMDR International Association, an association that governs EMDR therapists who are on the front lines working with trauma and PTSD. And that first course I got approved was how to use EMDR with spiritual trauma. Yeah. And so I guess that, that first question is, what is spiritual trauma? I kind of defined it fairly broadly, but I would say, in the most explicit cases, I've had clients who have actually been part of cults, and it's just overt the way that spirituality was used as a way to hurt them and control them. Mm-hmm. And there was very real trauma through that. Of course, whenever you have a clergy abuse situation, that's one of those more explicit forms of spiritual trauma, where you're not only going through the trauma of that betrayal and that abuse, but someone who's supposed to represent God or faith or goodness or trust has shattered a person's world, and now they're picking up the pieces, and what that does to someone's faith becomes kind of a double trauma in circumstances like that. Yeah. You also, not so much here in America, but around the world, there's a lot of persecution, depending on what kind of faith someone has and in what part of the world in these conflicts. And so there are definitely people who are suffering severe persecution for their faith, who have been imprisoned, who have been beaten, who have been had family members killed, things like that. And sometimes they'll come to America as refugees, and they'll end up in our offices working through those issues. And but I would say perhaps the most common type of spiritual trauma that I see is more subtle, but in its own way is just as traumatic. And so to validate for people who are thinking, oh, I didn't go through a war, I didn't go through a natural disaster, does this even count? In my experience, one of the most common negative beliefs that people take away from their childhood is some version of I'm not good enough.
Right.
And then if you happen to grow up in a spiritual tradition where either your parents, your pastor, people at the church heaped on a certain type of theology that accentuated that fact of not being good enough, and that wasn't counterbalanced with what we call grace in the church, or a perspective of love and forgiveness that should at the very least counterbalance that, then someone's left with this disproportionate feeling of I'm bad, I'm worthless, I'm condemned, something like that. But I would say that the good news, and I imagine you've seen that in your practice too, Bo, is that there can be healing for this.
Absolutely.
And there really is hope, and it can be a process, and it can be hard to face those things. But if you find a provider that listens, that cares, and that you can build that trust with over time, and that has an approach and has the tools to work with trauma effectively, there really can be incredible healing from the past, and a renewed perspective where the past doesn't feel so painful and so powerful, and it feels like there is a choice and hope and options for the future, and maybe like a second chances, a fresh start, things like that.
Yeah, I think that I think it's great that you just kind of validated the fact that spiritual trauma is trauma like any other trauma. I mean, trauma impacts the brain and impacts how we feel about ourselves and the world around us and God and everything. And these beliefs that we take on as little people and carry with us for the rest of our lives, things like I'm not good enough, or I'm worthless, or I'm unlovable, or can be so reinforced that it feels like reality to you, and and that's very damaging. I think that sometimes people have this thought of trauma that if I'm not having nightmares and flashbacks, then I probably haven't experienced trauma. And if I haven't been in combat, or if I haven't been a police officer or something, I haven't trauma. And it's just not true. Spiritual trauma is real. And I think that ongoing experience of spiritual trauma can very much shape how you feel about everything, those negative beliefs. So you say the most common type of spiritual trauma you've seen is just the I guess lack of grace, really, that comes into people experiencing these feelings of not good enough and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. And everyone has their own kind of particular bias or theological interpretation, but as someone who's been kind of in this faith-based counseling world for a long time, and been to seminary and worked through wrestling with these things, I just feel like, at least for Christians, and I know those watching may not identify with that, and that's okay. We're all in different places, how we see the world. But at least in my world, when it comes to Christian clients, even in churches where they're upholding a more traditional or conservative interpretation of the Bible, I would say even there, the word gospel literally means good news. And so if someone goes through a church and they never hear what sounds like good news, and precisely the idea that there's a God who loves us so much that despite us falling short, there's still love and grace and forgiveness and community there. Right. If that piece is missing, I think it really can be damaging. I think hypocrisy is another thing that can happen. In my course, we follow a story of a young boy who his dad's a leader in the church, and putting on the happy face, and everyone respects him. And then they get in the car and go home, and he's losing his temper, and he's yelling and demeaning and shaming. And, the truth is there needs to be grace for that kid. There needs to be grace for that dad. There's generations of trauma that's happening that gets passed on. And I guess that's the hope for us as therapists, right? Is that we can help be a vessel for healing, so that perhaps our clients will break some of those patterns. And even though none of us are perfect parents. Maybe they'll be able to have some tools and have some resources so that their kids grow up a little bit healthier than we did, right?
Right. Yeah. I guess that's always the hope is our kids are a little better off than we are.
So that's always the hope, I think. And I think the other thing that people don't talk about too as often is there are things that are common human experiences like grief and loss. And because it's so common, sometimes we minimize how devastating that can be.
Yeah.
I mean, even for myself, my dad passed away a couple of years ago, and I always felt like I had this rock solid faith. And I've had times in this journey of grief, losing my own dad, where it's like that feeling of where faith was feels like a hole sometimes.
Yeah.
And to find support and to work through that and realize that's very common, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're all human. And so whether we consider ourselves religious or not, we seem to be wired to look for purpose and meaning in this life.
Yeah.
And that raises hard questions that I think we all need to address, and we need love and support and care to navigate those things.
Yeah. And I just think too, you mentioned early on about just the trust that goes in, and oftentimes people think by default they can trust their pastors or whatever clergy in their place of worship, that they can trust them. And then when they're harmed by those people, it does a lot to fracture your ability to trust, and to feel like you can trust. And then if you have the same dynamic at home that you do within the church, it's just this reinforcing, and you believe these are people you can trust, and hopefully you can in many ways. But if you have people that you can trust that are reinforcing to you that you are a bad person, or that you're not lovable, or that it's just, it runs so deep. And you talk too about just the, I guess you can call it a trauma too, of like when you're coming into a place where it should be very safe and you should feel loved and accepted and cared for, and you present some sort of past trauma or something that you're going through, and you're not received well, and you're not cared well for, that can sort of add to the hurt.
It really can. Yeah, it's just one trauma on top of the other, right? And it becomes tricky because even with family systems and church communities that aren't the healthiest, they're still what we've got. They're still community. And so as people start to heal and differentiate themselves for not wanting to continue to expose themselves to certain things that are unhealthy, they have some very hard and painful decisions to make about how connected they want to be, on what terms, what boundaries they might need to set, or what space they need from certain people or from certain places in their healing process. And for some of my clients, and I'm sure you've seen this too, just the idea that they could set a boundary, that they're worth protecting, they're worth loving, that they deserve to have space to heal. That's like a foreign concept. And they might need some encouragement and some time to build up the strength to do that. And know that doesn't make them a horrible person. It doesn't make them a bad son. It doesn't make them a bad, whatever, fill in the blank. And then,
just having a voice, like you said, having a voice to be able to set boundaries. If you're coming from the context of a very controlling and authoritarian spiritual background, you may not believe at all that you have a voice or the right to speak up for yourself. And it's very complex. Like it's really hard. And I think that, again, sometimes, and I know you've had similar experiences, but clients will come in and say, "Hey, I gave the church another chance, and I came to this place, and within the context of the trauma I've experienced or what I'm going through, I was open and honest and vulnerable, and then I wasn't received well." And if you're coming to a place like that already, you because of the impact of that trauma, you might already have a sense of shame about you, and then not being received well, not being cared well for in that, just can pile more shame on top of what you're already feeling.
Yeah, it's kind of astounding, and I know I shouldn't be surprised, but how intelligent people, even in places like churches or different places, is like, in general, people aren't very good at listening, and their own stuff gets triggered in conversations, and so often when people just need a place to be like, can I be real and still be accepted? Can I be real and still, people put in their 2 cents, or they feel the quick need to fix something or give you advice.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good point, Bo, because people will sometimes ask me, well, I want to be able to trust so-and-so. And my line for them is, that's a great goal. And the goal is to be able to trust those who are trustworthy, not to blindly give your trust to people who are likely to break it. Right. Because then there's not wisdom in there, and you're setting yourself to be hurt again. And so, the old joke is, why are some churches so screwed up? It's like, well, because they're made up of people. Because we're all flawed, we're all works in progress, and hopefully a semi-healthy church has a good dose of understanding of grace and forgiveness. But I think some religions across the board have a tendency also to attract people who find solace in kind of knowing they're doing the right thing, and they have a manual they can follow of who's in, who's out, what's right and what's wrong. And that debate has been going on for thousands of years. I mean, in my tradition, it's like, if you read the Gospels, half of Jesus' arguments were with the pastors, with the Pharisees, who were like, here's the right thing to do. And he's like, you're missing the point.
Right.
So these old conversations continue to resurface, I think, in present day and in our churches, in our spiritual lives. And it's a hard task, but I also sometimes encourage my client to do the hard work of differentiating. Here's what I believe about God, if they believe in God, and how is God the same or different than the people who claim to represent him, but do it poorly.
Yep, absolutely. I think so much harm has been done in the name of God that people just assume that was God that did the harm.
Right.
And and that's just, again, it can become very complicated and confusing, and misplacing responsibility for something where, I've been hurt by the church or people within the church, therefore it must be God who, shares the same opinion and doesn't have grace for me, or
right.
Maybe, and I think too that oftentimes, I like to think anyway that oftentimes when people are hurt within a spiritual setting, that it's not intentional, it's not malicious, but it's out of not understanding, I guess, ignorance. And so if people come into a place where they should feel safe and secure and welcome and loved and nurtured, and they're open and honest about something, and they just are who they are, they come in an authentic way. People often are afraid of what they don't understand, and they turn and run from what they don't understand. So if you come in with a story that feels maybe upsetting in some way to someone, or your life experience looks different than someone else's, and they don't know what to do with it, like, okay, cool, and I think that's I don't believe that's an intentional harm, but it's definitely a harm, and it's again piles on more shame and hurt on top of what's already there.
Yes. And that's a really good point, because, in the trenches of an EMDR therapy session, people will be reprocessing these painful memories, thinking about the imagery and the sights and the sounds and the feelings and the beliefs that go with these memories. And during EMDR, sometimes people will feel a little stuck. And then as EMDR therapists, we give them that little nudge from the outside with a powerful question or an encouragement. And then you see the light bulb go off, and the brain is able to kind of connect the healing to another level. And that idea that a simple question, okay, so, your Sunday school said that mean thing when you were six years old, and it really set you up to feel like you were a failure for the rest of your life. That's so sad. And What do you think happened to your Sunday school teacher to talk that way to a 6-year-old kid?
Mhm.
Oh, well, I wonder if maybe some people weren't so nice to her. Oh,
Mhm.
interesting. Just think about that for a little bit. And then the wheels start turning and the EMDR session goes on. And then there's this connection to, yes, that wasn't right. I didn't deserve that. And this is another wounded person who's wounding someone else. This idea of the hurt people, right?
Yep.
And sometimes I never rush forgiveness or compassion. People need to feel their feelings where they're at.
Sure.
But as the healing process goes forward, oftentimes when the initial shame and anger and fear heal in a memory, something that looks a little bit like forgiveness or acceptance or even sadness, for multiple people in the process sometimes takes shape, because we do realize that it's far less personal than it feels. It's usually about the other person coming from their place of insecurity or woundedness.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, I think you're right. That's most of the time. It's particularly challenging for people who encounter something that actually feels like more like pure evil. And thankfully that feels more rare, but it's, but again, finding a good therapist and just having that safe space to talk about these things, like it's incredibly hopeful. And
Yeah.
people don't have to feel like they just have to just live with it the rest of their life and kind of hide in secret and feel like they're all alone with that, because they're not.
Yeah. And something I believe very much in is that felt safety is absolutely essential to being able to heal. Because if you don't feel safe, your brain's activated in a way that it's not going to be settled in a way that you can actually experience healing. And so if you're not feeling safe in your place of worship, that's not going to be a place of healing for you. And that's really unfortunate. And because I think it should very much be a place of healing for people. But if there's not felt safety in that place, and safety and felt safety are two different things. You may actually be safe in that place where no harm is going to come to you physically or whatever. But if you don't feel safe, it's not going to be a place of healing for you. And I think that too, you just talked about the Sunday school, injuring someone unintentionally, and if people are able to look at someone and instead of say, what's wrong with you? Because I think oftentimes within a spiritual context, people look at behaviors like what's this external behavior that I'm seeing, and let's correct these behaviors. And so then sometimes the question is like, what's wrong with you? Why are you behaving this way? And I think a better question is, what happened to you? What's wrong with you is what happened to you. And if we can, not only if people can, within a spiritual setting, within places of worship, if people can see others in that context of like, what happened to you, but also, like you said, when you feel hurt by someone, instead of asking the question, what's wrong with you, ask the question like, what happened to you that you would be treating me this way, which is easier said than done in the moment.
Yeah, it is.
Hurt.
But I think that's so right on. I mean, it's, I think asking that question can be a powerful thing to do. Because then it's, you're seeing the truth more fully, right? I mean, that's kind of a cognitive behavioral thing, but it's, I joke with my clients sometimes, like, if you're going to stress about something, make sure it's something that's true, right? Yeah. Life is hard enough. We don't want to stress about what's true, plus all these like half truths and distorted thoughts and assumptions. And, so I think, and that's the work of therapy. That's the work of, the work of healing. And, it takes time, but it also, I mean, I'd like to think that when my clients see that I'm on the schedule to meet with Mark that day, that part of them says, okay, I'm ready to do some work, but part of them looks forward to it too, because they know they're going to hopefully leave feeling encouraged and feeling like they took a step forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, sometimes spiritual trauma is intentional and malicious, and like you said, just straight evil.
Yep.
I think, sometimes it's coming from a context where a particular religion or spiritual orientation is controlling and authoritarian. And I think sometimes it's just unintentional and not malicious at all, but out of ignorance. But they're all impactful and they all cause harm, and they're all real traumas, and
They are.
like you said earlier, just to validate for people who may question, well, I wasn't in combat and, whatever. Still the things that you experience when you've been injured, spiritually, that's real trauma. And I tell my clients all the time, we're mind, body, and spirit. We're like made up of all these things. And so I can be injured physically, I can be injured mentally, and I can be injured spiritually. And they're all injuries, and they're all definitely can be classified as trauma,
Yep.
depending on that injury. So, Mark, thanks so much. If you were to, if you wanted to give a word of encouragement or some closing remark for anybody who may be watching this video, like what would you say to someone who's ended up here and watching a video about spiritual trauma and injury?
Yeah. Well, I would just say, if you're watching this, that you're certainly not alone with that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there is help. There is help out there. And I tell people that if you try therapy and for whatever reason it's not a good fit for the personality, or therapists are people too, and there's then I say don't quit therapy. Just find another therapist. Find a therapist that connects with you, that deeply cares,
Mm-hmm.
and can collaborate with you on a plan for how to move forward in a way that feels supportive. And there are resources out there. There are therapist directories, with trauma therapy like EMDR Therapy. There's websites where you can find therapist directories, find a therapist that's trained near you, or a certified EMDR therapist near you. Yeah. So I guess, I'll get a client every once in a while that'll say, well, be honest with me, Mark. Like, do you think I can actually heal? Does anyone heal from this? And thankfully I've been doing it long enough where I can confidently say, yes.
Yep.
Yes, you truly can. And I've seen it dozens, if not hundreds of times.
Mm-hmm.
And when trauma heals, I tell people it doesn't mean you forget what happened,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that your brain stores it has changed.
Yep.
Where your body feels calm and your mind gravitates toward the truthful adult interpretation of what happened.
Yeah.
And the truth about yourself, which is usually the exact opposite of that really painful lie that you picked up during the trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's powerful to think that there are therapies out there where you actually can look at a trauma and know that it's truly healed, because you can think about the worst part of it.
Yep. Your
body feels calm, and you can tell yourself the truth and actually have it feel true, not just in the head, but in the heart.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, just an analogy that I use sometimes is with clients, and that is, our brain can process stuff when we go to sleep at night, rapid eye movement sleep. Our brain can process things that we don't feel the next day what we felt the day before, if it's not trauma. If it's trauma, it doesn't work that way. But, I tell people, like, if you're in a traffic jam on the way to your appointment today, and you're going to be late, and you're frustrated, and you're banging on your steering wheel, and you're cussing because you're going to be late for your appointment, and that's really disturbing in the moment. You go to sleep at night, 24 hours later, you're not going to be feeling all that about that traffic jam.
Right.
You're going to look back at it, and you're like, oh, that kind of sucked. I don't want to do that again. But I'm not feeling that anymore. I'm not doing over sitting in traffic, because I'm not in traffic anymore. And that's exactly what can happen in processing trauma. Is like, you can look back at it, you can know it wasn't good, you don't want to do that again, but also you don't have to feel like you're right in the middle of it anymore. And that's the beauty of processing therapies like EMDR therapy.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that metaphor. That's a great way to end on that, Bo. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being with us. If people wanted to find you specifically and find out, you're an author and an artist and a poet, and you got so much going on. If people just want to connect with you and see what all you got going on, where can they find you?
Yeah. If you can always just Google my name. I'm on LinkedIn. My therapy practice has a funny website. It's called escapethecagenow.com, because the metaphor is to escape these cages that hold us back and to become the people that we were meant to be created to be. So, but yeah. Thanks for the chance to talk, and it was good. It was good talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate you.
All right.